But they all come from this kind of Syriac tradition, the Syriac language. But what they're doing is they're taking the Greek and they're translating it into Western Aramaic. They're taking the Greek and they're translating it into Eastern Aramaic. They're taking the Greek and they're translating it into Latin. So while we're Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are master, like our Greek copies are different from translations. Does that make sense? So the Vulgate is a translation, and as far as 1 John 5, 7, and 8 goes, this translation inserts a verse where there is none. So this is something we see a lot in the Vulgate, where we've got whole swaths of things that are either missing or added because of a usually, like, what they think this Comma Ioannium, is when scribes would write. Okay, they'd have this big piece of parchment. Okay, sometimes it's divided in half, sometimes it's not. But what they would do is they would be looking, they would be translating, and then over here they might put a scribal note in the margin. Okay, and because scribes are more conservative than they are liberal, and I mean that they're more apt to add things into the text if it's not clear that it's in the margin. Okay, than they are to delete things from the text. So if they see as they're writing, let's say many more years later, another guy comes along and he's asked to copy the same text because, copies wear out. Paper wears out. So he's copying, he comes along and he goes like this, okay? And he sees this marginal note. Well, this marginal note doesn't look like a marginal note to him. It looks like it's a continuation. And so instead of looking at this marginal note that scribes would write to each other, okay, he takes this marginal note and now he inserts it down here into the text. Okay? This is called an emendation.
What helps me to understand that was when a missionary goes, like from the translators, goes into a tribe, they learn a language, and they have to get the Bible into that language. They have to do the best they can to get the thought, the concept, into a print that will be that people's language. And so it's the way that missionary learning that language would do it, like from Wycliffe. But then later on, it may be that something has to be explained better. And like they've said, they have to put notes into explain
into the margin.
They chose certain ways to put
Right,
things.
right. And so sometimes when you're looking at this copy, they'll write in here, like, all of these scribal notes, there's a whole field of study dedicated to scribal emendations. Okay, that's what they're called. Looking at how, like, the longer ending of Mark, for example. Yes. The longer ending of Mark.
An additional chapter at the end of Mark.
Well, it's about 10 extra verses at the end of Mark, yeah. Whether that's original or not, or, is the woman at the well story, does that belong in the Gospel of John, or is that more like a Luke? Does it belong in Luke? But there's a whole field of study about these scribal notes, and sometimes they would write like their thoughts on what a verse meant, right? And sometimes that ends up in here, in the main text. Okay, and that's what's called a scribal emendation, and they're pretty apparent because all of a sudden we have this whole host of testimony of one reading, and then the very next copy, all of a sudden the reading changes. And there's either an addition or there's a deletion. So we know, and usually they're additions, so we know that somewhere between copy 12 and copy 13, assigning arbitrary numbers, there was a change in the text, and we can see those, and they're really apparent. And the Comma Ioannium is one. So, like I said, when Erasmus is combining all of the documents that would soon to become the TR, the Textus Receptus, which is the foundation for the King James translation, he wrote his first 3 editions of the Textus Receptus didn't have 1 John 5, 7, and 8 as they appear in the King James. And it was only after he was chided by the Vatican that he actually decided to put those into his translation. The other thing that can happen is the canon for the Catholic Bible and the canon for the Protestant Bible are very different. So they have a whole bunch of additional extra books like Judith and 1st and 2nd Maccabees and the Wisdom of Solomon. They've got some of these books. Ecclesiasticus. They've got some other things that are in there. We would call the Apocrypha. So there are some that would be seen as a removal by the Catholic Church, where we're saying no, those never should have been canon in the first place. So, does that help a little bit? So, when they're looking at their Bible, they're not getting the translation from the Hebrew and Greek. They're getting their translation from Greek into Latin into English. That's how their tradition goes. We go back to the Aramaic and the Hebrew, and we translate it into English. We go back to the Greek, and we translate it into English. When they say that the Latin translation is basically inspired, and so they don't go back to the Greek, they just go straight to the Vulgate, which is translated from Greek by Jerome. Anyway, that's more of how we got our Bible. But to answer you, I think that the NIV is based off of what's called the United Bible Society text, but I'll look that up real quick. I haven't used an NIV in a long time. It relies on the critical text. Okay. They do the Nestle and Land and the United Bible Society. So those are different Greek So a lot of when we talk about, especially the Greek, what we're talking about is the compilation of all of the Greek manuscripts that we have. And the United Bible Society will make their choices on which readings they think are the best based on the evidence that we have. And then the Nestle and Land, which is another set of manuscripts, another publisher, will take those same Greek manuscripts, that same tradition, and they'll say, this is the reason we think this is better. Okay? And so you'll have two different Greek readings based off of the same data. And so then when it comes time to do the translation work, what the NIV did was they took both the Nestle and Land edition, or the manuscript edition, and the United Bible Society, the UBS text, and they said, we're going to use these together, and then we will make editorial decisions on which reading we think is the correct one. Okay?
So which version do you use?
I use the NET.
NET.
Yeah.
More accurate?
No, I like they're more transparent with how they make their translation decisions.
It is very hard to read.
Yeah. So
I bought a copy and I tried reading it. I decided we were bad.
Back in the dinosaur days, the New American Standard was the best one.
Well, because now we have like the Living Translation, the Message. There's quite a few that
the Message is not a translation. So the Message is a paraphrase. So there's a distinction to be made there.
And there was the Phillips translation, but they were trying to put words into put it into words we would use, the way we would talk.
Modern English.
Yeah,
What was LET
I like
stand for?
the way we talk.
Excuse me.
What's LET stand for?
The New English Translation.
Oh,
Yeah.
Standard, I was always told us the way to go, but
But even for English translations, there must be at least 30 different ones.
What I like about the NET
is that it's not funded by
any one
anyone.
particular denomination or theological ideology. So their scholarship, their translation committee, had a bunch of different theological perspectives on it, and that allowed them to. I mean, it caused some tension in the translation committee, but it allowed them to
hammer out
good
readings because there weren't any prior commitments.
For example, like the ESV, which is the English Standard Version, is largely reformed in the way that it approaches its translations. Okay, the NASB is largely non-reformed in the way that it goes. However, there's a new version called the Legacy Bible, or Legacy Standard Bible, which takes the NASB and reforms it a little bit, puts it more into a reformed tradition.
what do you think of the ASB?
I love the NASB. I think NASB's good. But yeah, then the Net Bible, because their scholars were made up from people of different theological perspectives. You had the Reformed perspective represented. You had the non-Reformed perspective represented, and so they were a lot. It was the best of both worlds in a lot of respects. But I don't know what. It doesn't say what. I think they use the UBS. But yeah, and then you're going to have to look. Every translation committee is going to have their biases. Okay, so you're never going to have a perfect translation. Even when you look at the King James Bible, it has bias built into it. Okay, so like for example, King James demanded that they translate certain words certain ways to preserve ecclesiastical law as in him being the head of the church. So elder, presbyteros, which we would say elders and deacons, right? It's the language we would use, always had to be translated as bishop. It could never be translated as elder. And that was to preserve the hierarchy of the Anglican Church. Okay? And so he forced a lot of rules onto the translation committee to preserve that. The translation committee was also highly reformed. As Anglicans, they have a lot of reformed pre-commitments, and so a lot of that bias shows up. So you're not going to have a perfect translation because there's no perfect people. And we all have our biases in. What is the textual background of the Net Bible?
But I can remember during the King James Version days being taught that each word was precisely chosen by the Holy Spirit. And every
Right.
word was exactly as it should be.
Right. That's called That's called. We call that secondary inspiration. Is that doctrine? And there's no evidence that there's no evidence that ever happened. Yeah. So they would say that God breathed out the same way on the King James version of the Bible, King James translation, as the original, or in the same way that He breathed on the apostles and prophets. Okay, and that's.
Question.
Yes.
Are they all dependable?
Not all of them are dependable. No, by no means. Are you talking about the different translations? Are you talking about different translations? In so much as they try to stay true to the text, they are reliable. It's once you start, like, there's this new version called, I think it's called the Passion Translation. which is awful. Okay? Scholars say avoid it like the plague because there's nothing good that comes from it's more of it's a paraphrase and a bad one that purports itself to be a translation. And this guy says he was inspired by the Holy Spirit to translate the Bible in this way. Okay? So avoid that one like the plague. Okay? The Message Bible, I've mentioned the Message, or the Message was mentioned, gets maligned a lot. It's by a man named Eugene Peterson. Okay? And the thing about Eugene Peterson is he never actually said this is a translation. He always said this is a paraphrase. And he's trying to get the modern sense. His idea was, I want to try to put this in modern terms so that people can understand it. And it was more of a devotional tool as opposed to a translation. He never wanted it to be a translation. If this guy wanted to do a translation, he could have, because he was an expert in Hebraic and Ugaritic languages and in Greek. Okay? That's why he's Dr. Eugene Peterson, and he could have done that. Ugaritic is kind of you probably never heard of that, have you? Is the parent language. We all languages have parent languages, okay? For English, the parent language is Proto-Indo-European, okay? That's our parent language. The parent language for all of the Semitic languages is called Ugaritic. And it's a dead language. Nobody speaks it anymore like Latin. He's dead now. He was an expert in that language, okay? And how that language informed the development of Hebrew, of Syriac, of Aramaic, of all these different languages. And he was an expert in Greek. Which is, when you learn more about him, he was an amazing man. But the Message is just a paraphrase. So he tried to take these big concepts and put them into modern imagery that people could understand.
I looked at the message and they're trying to put it into, like you said, words that the average person can understand.
Right.
I think that's okay.
Yeah. They might have used. I don't know. I think they used the UBS, which again is a good. That's a good bet. United Bible Society. I have both the Nestle Aland and the United Bible Society texts in my office because they're just good to have. Any other questions on languages or things like that? Just to give you an idea of the Passion Translation and why one should avoid it.
I haven't even heard of it, so I assume it's not widespread.
It's gaining a lot of traction. It's not even done yet.
It's not even done. It's fresh bread.
Excuse me. It was popular, I think.
The Passion? No, this is a new one. Yeah, this is a new one. Like it just came out and they haven't. So like, let me punch up my. Do I not have YouVersion on my phone? For shame. Okay.
My wife does YouVersion. Oh yeah. YouVersion's actually not bad. If you're looking for a good Bible app,
YouVersion is not bad. They have most of the available translations today, and if you're connected to the internet, it's for free. If you want to download it, you have to pay for it. But if you're connected to the internet, YouVersion will allow you to act. I do have it on here.
There you go.
I must have fat fingered the search. All right. So let me give you an example of the Passion and why. Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to a place where we've been. All right. Something that you guys would recognize. I'm going to read it out of this, and then I'll read it out of the Passion. I don't want to be in Thessalonians. I want to be in Matthew. All right. Just go back to Matthew 5 and listen to this out of the net, okay? When he saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain. After he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began teaching them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things against you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, because your reward is great in heaven, for they persecuted the prophets before you in the same way." All right? Pretty self-explanatory. Now, here's how this guy translates it. One day, Jesus saw a vast crowd of people gathering to him, so he went down the slope of a hill and sat down. With his followers and disciples spread over the hillside, he sat down. Okay? He spread over the hillside, Jesus began to teach them. He left some words out. Okay? What happiness comes to you when you feel your spiritual poverty, for yours is the realm of heaven's kingdom. All right? What delight comes to you when you wait upon the Lord, for you will find what you long for. What blessing comes to you when gentleness lives in you, for you will inherit the earth. All right? Is this even sounding anything like I remotely just read? How enriched you are when you crave righteousness, for you will be satisfied. How blessed you are when you demonstrate tender mercy, for tender mercy will be demonstrated to you. What bliss you will experience when your heart is pure, for then your eyes will open to see more and more of God. How joyful you are when you make peace, for you will be recognized as true children of God. How enriched you are when persecuted for doing what is right, for then you experience the realm of heaven's kingdom. How blessed you are when people insult you and persecute you and speak all kinds of cruel lies about you because of your love for me. Doesn't say that. So leap for joy, since your heavenly reward is great, for you are being rejected in the same way the prophets were rejected before you. All right, here's some other examples. He actually has John done. Wow. All right. Where is it?
To sum it up,
For here is the way that God loved the world. He gave his only unique Son as a gift. So now everyone who believes in him will never perish, but experience everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to judge and condemn the world, but to be its Savior and rescue it. So there is no longer any condemnation for those who believe in him, but the unbeliever lives under condemnation because they do not believe in the name of the only Son of God. So it sounds okay-ish. But when you read like an actual translation, there are subtle shifts in the way that he uses the language. To like earlier in that chapter when he's talking to Nicodemus, he says, "Spirit only gives birth to spirit." Well, he'll say the spiritual realm only gives birth to that which belongs to the spiritual realm. So he's Bill Johnson. You guys know that name?
Yes.
He wholly supports the Passion Translation. Okay.
Strange.
Yeah, Bethel Ministries, that big cult. So don't. Yeah. Anyway, this is a bad. Don't touch that one. But most of the translations that we can get to that are good are the ones that at the outset have their goal to honor God with the translation they're doing and to best and most accurately represent the text. Okay? And the ways that they do that are a multitude, okay? So like the ESV, the NASB, the Legacy Standard Bible, they take what's more known as what they call formal equivalency, okay? So formal equivalency is more along the lines of they're trying to be more word for word, as much as you can. Okay? I don't like formal equivalency. Can you think of a reason why formal equivalency might be a problem?
Some concepts don't translate.
Concepts don't translate well. Okay, so if you're trying to go word for word, but you come across a metaphor, okay? The Bible is replete with metaphors. If you try to translate a Hebraic metaphor literally, it's not going to come across well in English or any other language. Okay? It'll still make sense in Hebrew. They still use the Old Testament the way it was written all those millennia ago. Because the Hebrew language really hasn't changed all that much since then. It's added new words, some grammar conventions have been updated, but you can still, if you go to Hebrew school, you can still read the Old Testament and understand it perfectly, including the metaphors. But in a formal equivalency setting, you have to, if you're trying to preserve that word for word feel, you're going to fall short in a lot of respects because you just don't have the language tools at your disposal. The other version, which is like the NET, the NIV, probably the Living Translation, which is also excellent. Those are what we call dynamic. And what dynamic equivalency does is it, as opposed to word for word, is thought for thought. All right? So we're trying, that's not to say dynamic equivalency won't go word for word where it's appropriate. But when we're trying to turn over a thought or a concept or a metaphor, they might try to take a more, let's take this thought and put it into English as best we can. Okay? Because it doesn't make sense if you translate it literally. Dynamic or formal equivalency will have to do the same thing with some metaphors, because obviously they don't make sense, so they'll have to default back to kind of a more dynamic equivalency. But this is trying more along the lines to be thought for thought more often than not. This is trying to be more word for word more often than not. Okay? And so two different styles of translation. I prefer dynamic equivalency because I want to know the idea, the thought, the concept. And formal equivalency tries to tend to stumble over that. They make it way too wordy, or they make it so abstract that you can't wrap your head around it. Whereas a dynamic equivalency, you can kind of wrap your head more around the thought. So if you're looking for a good translation, look for one that seeks to honor the Hebrew and the Greek and the Aramaic, and that the goal of the translation committee is to best represent those documents. Here's the other thing you have to keep in mind. Not all scholars who work on translation committees are believers, and that's okay. All right? These translation committees, all of them have non-believers on them who are experts in the languages, whose job it is to translate these ancient documents. Okay? And sometimes they bring in valuable information about how certain words were used in certain contexts and that kind of thing. But they are still trying as best they can to help the translation committee get across with integrity the text that they have in front of them. Just keep that in mind. All the translation committees do that because we don't have all the experts. Yes?
How will AI affect all this?
AI,
Artificial intelligence.
Right. It depends on how you phrase the question. Okay? I have seen some AI translations that do a really good job. That will, depending on whether you ask them for dynamic equivalency or formal equivalency, they'll spit out something that sounds a lot like how a translation committee would do that. In fact, say that again? Oh. So that's not to say that, they're going to replace totally translation committees with AI. But AI could be a tool that translation committees use to look at all of the different manuscripts that we have and make the best choices according to the data it's given. Now, the thing you have to remember with AI, just like any computer program, is garbage in, garbage out. So if you start with bad programming, if you start with bad documentation, you're going to get a bad translation. Okay? But much like, and that's going to be true of a translation committee too. If they're starting with a garbage text, they're going to have a garbage translation. But it could be a tool that could be accessible to a translation committee that might be valuable. Because there's no way a translation committee can look at all the different documents all at once like a computer can. Does that make sense? Even today, I can run a program to word search for me on my Logos, and the search engine will kick that back, and it will give me all of the documents and all the details I need about that word, and where it appears not only in the New Testament text, but also where it appears elsewhere in classical Greek, or even other writings outside of the New Testament that would have been in Greek, like with documentation in the Roman Empire. And that's something that an AI can do and say, well, this word, like for example, when it says Jesus Christ was paid as a ransom on our behalf, okay? It's that word, lutron, okay? This word is translated as ransom, but it can also mean, and I don't mean this in an anatomical sense, but it can also mean booty, like treasure, okay? But this is a financial word, and so we can use to see how this financial word is used not only in the New Testament, but also how it's used everywhere else in Greek in that time period, to really get a good understanding of how this word functioned in society. All right. Jesus was given as a ransom, which means he was given as, really, this word then we go payment to sin and death, right, on our behalf. So he made the payment for us. But we see how that works when we start going down the trees and we're like, okay, ransom or booty, it's definitely not treasure, but he is a treasure. But it's more along the lines of that payment, which is why then Christ can say this. Oops, that's an Englishy. On the cross, right? He says tetelestai, which means it is finished. Why does he say it is finished? We translate that as it's finished, but really, this is another financial term.
Paid in full.
Yeah, paid in full. He paid the ransom in full. So this was stamped on our debt, tetelestai. Right? Jesus could have used any number of words to describe how his death, he could have used any number of words to say it is finished. He chose a financial term because he knew he was giving his life as a payment. Yeah.
1 minute. To explain the difference between formal and dynamic and sign language, American Sign Language. There's, do you want to go with me to the movies
Yeah.
versus,
Yeah.
you mean movies?
Yeah.
You mean movies?
Yeah.
With a question mark on your face
Right.
and then a little bit of a go.
Yeah.
Versus, do you want to go with me to the movies?
Right.
That's formal.
Right. Well, and then formal equivalency again would be like that. No tengo pelo en mi lengua. I don't have hair on my tongue. I'm not lying to you. Okay. That formal equivalency would say, I don't have hair on my tongue. Dynamic equivalency would be, I swear to goodness, I'm not lying. Right? The formal doesn't make sense. The thought for thought does. All right. If there aren't any other questions, but that's the long way of answering. She's talking about the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Greek text that has additions to it. So it's not really that we're deleting from the text. What we're doing is we're removing from the text what should have never been there. That make sense? Okay. The King James Version guys will do that all the time, where they'll say, you're deleting, you're removing it from the text. Well, if you added it to the text, it shouldn't have been there anyway, so we need to pull it out to know what the text actually says.